There's a specific moment when a narcissist's anger stops being about winning and starts being about making you pay. A shift that changes everything about how dangerous the situation actually is, and one that far too many people miss because they're still interpreting his behavior through the lens of the relationship they used to have rather than the one they're actually in now. Today, we're walking through the real signs that indicate a narcissist has moved from ordinary manipulation into something considerably more dangerous, a deliberate campaign of retaliation. Some of what we'll cover is uncomfortable but manageable: reputational sabotage, financial interference, attempts to turn mutual connections against you. Some of it, though, crosses into territory that requires more than psychological understanding. It requires real safety planning. We'll be clear about which is which as we go. Let's start with why revenge, specifically, differs from the ordinary manipulation tactics we've discussed throughout this entire series. Everything we've covered before this point has largely centered on a narcissist trying to maintain access, trying to restore supply, trying to reassert relevance in your life. Revenge is different in one crucial way. It no longer requires your continued presence or engagement in order to succeed. He doesn't need you to come back. He simply needs you to suffer in whatever form that suffering can be delivered, ideally without consequences, returning to him. This shift typically occurs under one specific condition worth understanding clearly: when he's concluded, correctly or not, that he has genuinely, permanently lost access to you and every other tactic we've discussed throughout this series. The vulnerability, the proximity testing, the performed thriving D has failed to produce any reaction at all. Revenge often emerges specifically from this failure, a kind of last resort when supply restoration seems definitively unavailable. Sign 1. Sudden, coordinated character attacks across multiple relationships simultaneously. Watch for a specific pattern, rather than the gradual narrative revision we discussed in earlier conversations. You begin hearing, through several unconnected people, versions of the same negative story about you, arriving within a similar time frame. This coordination suggests deliberate campaign rather than organic gossip, and it typically escalates in specificity and cruelty compared to anything he's said about you before. Sign 2. Interference with your professional or financial stability. This might look like contacting your employer with false information, attempting to disrupt business relationships, or interfering with shared financial obligations in ways clearly designed to cause harm rather than resolve any legitimate dispute. This is a significant escalation from emotional manipulation into material harm, and it often indicates someone willing to cross boundaries he previously respected, at least outwardly. Sign 3. Escalating contact after being told to stop, particularly involving surveillance-like behavior. This is where the conversation needs to become direct rather than purely explanatory. If you're noticing unexplained knowledge of your whereabouts, your schedule, or people you've recently seen, information he shouldn't have access to, combined with continued contact after clear communication that contact is unwanted, this is not simply obsession in the psychological sense we've discussed in previous conversations. This is a pattern that intersects with stalking behavior, and it needs to be treated with the seriousness that term requires, regardless of how the person doing it might explain or minimize it. Let's continue through the remaining signs, because the second half of this list moves further into territory where understanding the psychology matters less than recognizing danger and knowing what to actually do about it. Sign 4. Threats, whether explicit or thinly veiled, involving your safety, your reputation, or people you love. This sign deserves careful, direct examination, because narcissists are often skilled at delivering threats in ways designed to maintain deniability. Phrasing that could theoretically be explained away as a joke, a moment of anger, or an offhand comment while still landing with unmistakable menace. You'll regret this. People are going to find out what you're really like. I know things about you that could ruin everything you've built. Wouldn't it be a shame if something happened to these statements, regardless of how casually delivered, regardless of whether he later claims he was just venting or didn't mean it that way, should be taken at face value rather than explained away. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why this specific sign matters so much more than the others we've discussed throughout this entire series. Everything we've covered previously about narcissistic psychology assumed a baseline of manipulation without physical danger. Threats change that assumption entirely. A pattern of threats, even ones you might be tempted to dismiss as just talk because you know him well enough to believe he wouldn't follow through, represents a genuine escalation that research on interpersonal violence consistently identifies as one of the strongest predictors of actual harm. Threats are not simply an extension of emotional manipulation. They occupy an entirely different category, one that requires different tools than psychological understanding to address safely. Sign 5. Attempts to isolate you from support systems, specifically after the relationship has ended. Watch for continued efforts to damage your relationships with friends, family, or new partners, not simply through the narrative revision we've discussed extensively, but through active, ongoing interference, showing up uninvited, contacting people specifically to create conflict, attempting to insert himself into your support network in ways clearly designed to make you more isolated and therefore more vulnerable. Isolation attempts occurring after a relationship's clear ending, rather than during it, represent a significant shift worth taking seriously because isolation is one of the most consistent precursors to escalating harm across abusive dynamics generally. Sign 6. Sudden, dramatic shifts in his behavior toward calm, reasonable contact specifically designed to lower your guard. This one is counterintuitive, and it's worth understanding carefully because it inverts the pattern you might expect. Sometimes, following a period of visible anger or escalation, a narcissist plotting genuine retaliation shifts abruptly into calm, cooperative, even friendly behavior, not as genuine de-escalation, but as a deliberate strategy to reduce your vigilance before acting. If a sudden, unexplained shift toward reasonableness follows a period of genuine threat or escalation, particularly if it coincides with requests for in-person contact, access to shared property, or information about your schedule, treat this pattern with real caution rather than relief. What to actually do if you recognize these signs? Here is where this conversation needs to move from explanation into action, because understanding these patterns matters far less than knowing what to do once you've recognized them. First, document everything, immediately and thoroughly. Screenshots, dates, times, witnesses, if any exist. This isn't simply for your own psychological clarity, the way we've discussed documentation in previous conversations. It's potential evidence, and it needs to be preserved in a format that can't be easily disputed or deleted, backed up somewhere he cannot access, ideally somewhere outside any shared devices or accounts. Second, take explicit threats seriously regardless of your own assessment of whether he'd actually do it. You are not required to be the one who correctly predicts his behavior. Local police in most jurisdictions can document threat reports even before any physical act occurs, and this documentation matters enormously if the situation escalates further. Third, if there is any interference with your professional life, financial accounts, or online presence, this often crosses into territory covered by harassment or cyber-stalking laws, depending on your location. This is worth consulting with an actual attorney or your local domestic violence advocacy organization about, even if the relationship wasn't a marriage or a legally defined domestic partnership. Many of these protections apply more broadly than people realize. Fourth, if you're in the United States, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233, or text START to 88788, can help you build a safety plan specifically tailored to your situation, whether or not you consider what you experienced domestic violence in the traditional sense. Stalking behavior specifically has its own dedicated resource, the Stalking Prevention, Awareness, and Resource Center, SPARS, and many areas have local victim advocacy organizations that can help with safety planning, protective orders, and connecting you to resources specific to your jurisdiction. If you're outside the U.S., your country's domestic violence or victim support services will have equivalent resources and a quick search for domestic violence hotline, plus your country name will connect you to them. Fifth, and this matters enormously, trust your own instinct over any impulse to minimize what's happening because he's not really that kind of person, or we used to be so close. The psychological work we've discussed throughout this entire series about seeing a narcissist clearly applies here too, but with higher stakes. If something feels genuinely dangerous, it deserves to be treated as genuinely dangerous, regardless of how much history exists between you, regardless of how much you might still, in some complicated way, care about who he used to be to you. Here's the important final distinction worth understanding as this conversation closes. Not every difficult ending involves genuine danger, and most of what we've traced throughout this entire series, the narrative revision, the obsession, the collapse, the attention-seeking, falls well short of the specific signs we've discussed today. Most narcissistic exes, however psychologically exhausting, do not escalate into genuine threat or stalking behavior. This conversation isn't meant to make you newly afraid of every difficult interaction with someone from your past. But if you recognize several of these 6 signs together, particularly the ones involving threats, surveillance-like knowledge, or escalating contact after clear boundaries, this is not a moment for the calm, boundaried strategies we've discussed throughout the rest of this series. Those strategies were built for protecting your peace against manipulation. This is a different situation, requiring different tools, documentation, professional support, and real safety planning, pursued without shame, without minimizing, and without waiting to see if things get worse before you reach out for help. What not to do when you're in danger. From a narcissist. There's a specific set of instincts almost everyone reaches for when they sense real danger from someone who used to be close to them. Instincts that feel logical, even responsible, in the moment, but that consistently make dangerous situations worse rather than better. Today, we're walking through exactly what not to do, because in situations involving genuine threat, the wrong instinct isn't just unhelpful. It can be the difference between de-escalation and disaster. Don't confront him directly about the danger you've sensed. This is the single most common mistake, and it comes from a genuinely understandable place. You want to address what's happening honestly, the way you might with any other conflict. I know you've been watching my social media obsessively. I know you told our friends those things about me. This instinct treats the situation like ordinary conflict resolution, something we've spent this entire series teaching you to do well. But someone escalating toward genuine danger isn't operating according to the same rules as ordinary conflict. Confronting him directly about specific surveillance or threats can accelerate escalation because it removes his sense of control, and unpredictability tends to increase risk rather than reduce it. Document instead of confronting. Report to authorities instead of addressing him directly. Don't try to reason with someone who is actively escalating. Everything we've discussed throughout this series about narcissistic psychology assumed a baseline where calm, boundaried communication could at least protect your own peace, even if it didn't change him. That assumption doesn't hold once someone has moved into genuine threat or stalking behavior. Attempting to explain your position, appeal to old affection, or negotiate a truce treats the situation as a relationship problem rather than a safety problem. It isn't. Save your energy and your safety for the professionals equipped to handle this specific situation. Don't stay silent to avoid overreacting or making it worse. This is perhaps the most dangerous instinct of all, because it often comes wrapped in genuine, reasonable sounding logic. Maybe if I don't make a big deal of this, it'll fade out on its own. Maybe reporting it will just make him angrier. Maybe I'm misreading the situation and I'll look foolish. This hesitation is common, and it is not your fault if you felt it. But silence doesn't reliably reduce danger, and waiting for more evidence before acting often means waiting until something worse has already happened. Documentation and reporting can happen quietly, without dramatic confrontation, and they create a record that protects you, regardless of how things unfold. Don't rely solely on mutual friends to monitor or mediate the situation. It's tempting to use shared connections as a buffer or an information source, but this can backfire in two ways. It can give him continued access to information about you, and it can put people you care about in an uncomfortable or even risky position. Keep your safety planning between yourself and professionals equipped to help, advocates, law enforcement, an attorney, rather than routing it through your social circle. Don't assume a protective order or police report will end things immediately. Don't minimize what you're experiencing because it doesn't look like the dramatic version you've seen in movies. Real danger is often quiet, gradual, and easy to explain away in the moment. If something in this series of signs matched what you're living through, that recognition is valid, whether or not it fits a more dramatic picture of what real danger is supposed to look like.